And here we go. And our topic today is, doesn't the Bible support slavery? Of course, there's a number of different individuals and groups sort of making that claim. But is it true? I don't know, Doctor. I mean, I do know, but I'm not going to tip it off here. Don, why don't you lead on here on this one?
Yeah, no spoilers. Okay. Uh, well, it's an interesting question. After what we saw last week, with the Bible being so profoundly anti-racist, in fact, um, how would anybody ever get the idea that it would support slavery? Well, the Old Testament uh, tolerates it. The New Testament doesn't condemn it. Uh, Paul sent Onesimus back to his master. So there's a lot of things about the Bible that could easily lead somebody to draw this conclusion. And yet, historically, in the West, slavery was ended by people like William Wilberforce, who took the Bible seriously and tried to apply it to life in England, for example, or John Newton, the ex slave trader who was converted to Christ and became a great opponent of slavery. So, how do you get those guys coming out of a book that simply represents, at this point, I think in some ways, represents the ancient world? It's hard for modern Americans to understand this because, we put slavery behind us 150 years ago, and it's like we can't understand how anybody could ever have tolerated such an evil thing. And yet, for almost the entire history of the entire world, slavery was simply a fact of life, and
You know
something
that
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 people had to deal with.
that's important. I'd like to touch on that for a moment because many who read the Bible take what they read in there as prescriptive rather than descriptive. And in some cases, they are practices that were going on that God didn't end necessarily, but set up parameters under which they would operate. Do you think that this falls into that category?
To a certain extent, yes, it does. Let's move on to the first screen and see if we can get a better handle on what the question actually is.
Okay.
So, if the Bible is as deadly to racism as we saw last week, how could anybody think it supports slavery? Well, the Old Testament permitted it. Uh, the New Testament doesn't condemn it. And
Oh, we got
Paul
an issue.
sends Onesimus, the runaway slave, back to his master. Um,
I got to take this down and start it over again. I got some kind of weird issue going on.
okay.
I'm going to bring it right back up here, just quick as quick can be. I've
So
never had that happen before. It's like it just grew this magnifying glass.
we have become slaves to our technology,
Yeah, for sure, for
and
sure.
and the Bible has very little to say about that directly.
It's true.
Often, when the Bible doesn't speak to something directly, it gives you the principles that you can use to come to a godly conclusion about it, understand what they are, and apply them.
Like, thou shall restart your computer.
And
No,
apply
I don't have to restart a computer. I just had to get that brought up to date here
Ah,
and go present
there you go.
and screen uh, and go share, and there it is.
And boom.
There we go. So, how could anybody think the Bible supports slavery? There's a lot of facts about the Bible that could easily lend somebody to draw this conclusion. The Old Testament permitted it, the New Testament tolerates it, neither explicitly condemns it, and Paul sends the runaway slave Onesimus back to his master, Philemon. Uh, so, with racism last week, you really have to be reading the Bible with an agenda to think that the Bible is a racist book. But with the question of slavery, no, the Bible doesn't really support slavery, but you don't have to be an idiot to think it does. There are certain facts that are really facts about Scripture that would tend to make you think in this direction. So let's move on and take a closer look at what the situation actually is. We got to get the context, and some preliminary considerations will help us do that. The first thing we have to understand is that, in fact, slavery and racism are two completely different issues. Now, they're not for us because American Negro slavery, the kind of slavery that's part of our direct history, was based on race. But in ancient times, race had nothing to do with slavery. Slavery, of course, is much more evil when it is combined with racism and based on race, because your skin color creates a presumption of your status that just makes life very difficult for you, even if you're a free person. But ancient slavery wasn't based on race. The way you got to become a slave in ancient times was you could be sold into slavery to pay your debts. If you owed money and were behind on your payments, you might be sold into slavery to pay off your debts. A good way of getting into slavery in ancient times was you became a prisoner of war. We're so enlightened now, we put our prisoners of war in concentration camps.
Yeah.
But in ancient times, they were much more practical. They sold them into slavery. So it had nothing to do with race. Slaves could be any race. Free people could be any race. In fact, the modern concept of race wasn't even part of ancient people's thinking. They were much more attuned to tribes or families or nation groups, not race. It wasn't based on race. Ancient slavery, the kind of slavery that was existing in Bible times, wasn't as much of a fate as the more recent slavery that we're familiar with. Because it wasn't based on race, it was much more fluid. It was easier to get into it. It's also easier to get out of it. There were many examples of ancient people, slaves. Maybe the master gave you a little bit of free time. Maybe you started your own little side hustle, or maybe your family and your friends would collect the money and pay your debt, buy you back out of slavery. You could get into it. You could get out of it. It wasn't necessarily a lifelong sentence, although, of course, for many people it was. In American Negro slavery, the kind of slavery that was part of our history, slaves were basically people who did menial labor. But in ancient times, slaves did a large variety of jobs, and there were some slaves who had nicer jobs than a lot of free people. Epictetus, for example, was a philosopher who was a slave. Many slaves were school teachers. So let's say that you're homeschooling your kids, which is not just a modern phenomenon, by the way. People have always been doing that. Let's say you're homeschooling your kids, and so you go down to the slave market, and there's a guy who's a prisoner of war that your country captured, who before he was drafted into the army was a school teacher. So you buy him, bring him home, and his job is to teach your kids reading, writing, and arithmetic, because that's what he knows how to do. So a slave isn't necessarily doing menial labor. You might have a slave that's an accountant in your company. Now, the difference between him and a free person, of course, is um, if I'm a free man, I'm working for your company as an accountant, and I don't like you, I can quit. And the slave doesn't have that option. The other difference is that if I'm a free citizen of a democratic city state like Athens, for example, being a free person, I can vote, whereas the slave doesn't get to vote. But many slaves in ancient times had cushier lives than many free people. And there were different forms of slavery, some of which were really more like indentured servitude than slavery. Now, I'm not saying that ancient slavery wasn't an evil. It's always evil to make property out of another human being. But the biblical form of slavery, the kind of slavery that the Bible tolerated, it's important to understand that it's not necessarily it's not like that picture on the right, which of course is from the slave trade and the slave ships and the horrible conditions. Now, if you were a galley slave or got sent to the salt mines, that was a fate worse than death. And as a slave, you don't have a choice in what your job's going to be. So it's not a good thing. And it could be very, very terrible. But just to assume that slavery as we know it in our recent history is what they're talking about in the Bible when they talk about slavery is a false assumption. The other preliminary consideration that we really need to stop and think about is to remember that while Athens, the city-state Athens was a democracy, Rome, the Roman Empire, was not a democracy. Democratic protest was not available to people. Okay, so people get really up on their high horse in moral dudgeon because the New Testament, for example, doesn't condemn slavery. What are we asking them to do? You know, it's not like they could come up with an anti-slavery platform and try to elect candidates that would get that passed, like Wilberforce did in Parliament in England. What do we expect these people to do? It's just a fact of life, and it never occurred to anybody that they could end it. You know, you would want to help your people avoid it if you could, but what do we expect the biblical writers to have done? I mean, if Paul had instead of sending Onesimus back to Philemon, if Paul had incited a slave revolt, he would have just got a lot of people killed and accomplished absolutely nothing. And the whole idea would never have come into his mind in any case. So none of the nations that are part of the biblical story were democracies. Okay, there were monarchies, there were empires ruled by the Roman Caesar was actually more powerful than the king. Caesar was thought to be God. The ancient Christians got into trouble because they refused to worship Caesar as a god, even though, except for that, they were model citizens. So, yeah, it's not really trying to overthrow the system, change the system, wasn't really something that was available to people. We've gotten used to that, and we've gotten spoiled by living in a democracy for the last 200 years plus, going on 250 now. But you know, that's just not what the ancient world was like. It's not what it was all about. Okay, well, what did biblical people who are faithful to the true God do in response to slavery? How did they deal with it? Uh, let's look at the New Testament teaching about that applies to it. 1 Corinthians 7:21-24. Let's start there. So Paul in 1 Corinthians is uh, dealing with practical application of the Christian faith to different groups of people, to married people, husbands and wives, children, employees, etc. And in chapter 7, verse 21, he turns to the issue of slavery. Were you called to be a Christian, called to faith in Christ? Were you called while a slave? Don't worry about it. If you're able to become free, rather do that. If you get a chance to gain your freedom, take it, because freedom is better than not being free. Were you called while a slave? Don't worry about it. If you're able to become free, do that. For he who is called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's free man. Likewise, he who was called while free is Christ's slave. You were bought with a price. Do not become the slaves of men. But if it's too late, it's already happened. In other words, all right, if you're a Christian, you're not to look at slavery as an option. All right, like if you're a Christian, you have economic hard times. Don't go into debt where you can't pay it off, and if you find yourself there, don't sell yourself into slavery because you already belong to somebody else. Okay, but if circumstances have dictated this, I mean, you were already a slave before you became a Christian, before you got saved, then don't worry about it. You were bought with a price by Christ. So you're Christ's slave. All Christians are slaves of Christ. Don't become the slaves of men. That would possibly put you in a compromising situation. But brethren, each one is to remain with God in that condition in which he was called. So if you are a slave, then you're supposed to serve your master from the heart as if you were serving Christ. Give him good service. The bottom line is we don't want the Christian faith to be spoken ill of. We don't want people saying, these Christians are just uppity. They're no good. You can't get any work out of them. Don't want to go there. So there's that first passage which tells you freedom is a value. Okay. Paul says, if you get a chance to get your freedom, take it. If you're not a slave, don't put yourself in that position. So freedom is good. It is a good, but it's not the greatest good. Something's more important than whether or not you're free in terms of your human status. And that would be that you're serving God and that you are not a bad testimony for Christ. So we're all Christ's slaves and Christ's free. We're all slaves with reference to Christ. We're all free with reference to other people. And that transcends your status in society. We're all Christ's slaves and Christ's free men. Next passage is
1 Corinthians 7:22.
yeah, we're already there.
Oh, okay.
That's part of 21-24. Yeah,
I got you. Snuck it in on me. There you go.
There we go. Galatians 3:28. Back up to Galatians. Or move forward to Galatians. Yeah. Galatians chapter 3, verse 28. Here we go. There's neither Jew nor Greek. There's neither slave nor free man. There's neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ. Uh, so your status in society stops at the door of the church. It doesn't come with you past that door. Uh, Once you're in the church, in that church community, then your slave status is not to be held against you. None of that stuff matters. Now, it doesn't mean that there's no difference between Jews and Greeks or between men and women. I mean, the New Testament teaches certain differences in role uh, between men and women in the home and in the church. It means that uh, they're all on the same footing when it comes to their spiritual status. They all come to Christ the same way, by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone. And your social status that society puts on you drops away when you walk through the door of the church. Inside the church, you're all Christ's slaves, you're all Christ's free men. And so there are realities that, you're to think of yourself not as a lesser human being or a second class. You're not a second class citizen in the church, even if you are in society. So there would be no reason why a person who is a slave out on the street might be an elder inside the church. You are being introduced to a life and a society where your status as a human being created in the image of God, redeemed by the blood of Christ, subject of John 3:16, all these things are something that you're supposed to experience when you're inside the church. So there's this contrast between the church and the world. So once you cross that threshold into the church assembly, there's no slavery in the church, because we're all the slaves of Christ and we're all free in Christ with reference to everybody else. So there's some interesting teaching. Secular social status disappears at the door of the church. Then, kind of interestingly, the New Testament doesn't say that slavery must be abolished. It doesn't even quite say Christians can't own slaves. You get a kind of an interesting situation. Yeah, you can have a slave as long as you treat him like Jesus, which is in the long run is going to undermine this whole idea of slavery in a more profound way than a direct attack on it, I think, ever could. Matthew 25:40. The king will answer and say to them, "Truly I say to you, to the extent that you did it to one of the least of these brothers of mine, even the least of them, you did it to me." So how you treat a Christian, as far as Jesus is concerned, that's how you are treating him. Anything you do to a Christian, your fellow Christian, or anything somebody else does to a Christian, anything you do to a Christian, you're doing to Jesus. He takes it personally. And you see that being put into very practical terms in the conversion of Saul on the road to Damascus. Saul's on his way to Damascus to persecute the Christians that are there. All of a sudden, this light shines brighter than the sun, knocks him off his horse. He hears this voice from heaven saying, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" Not, "Why are you persecuting my people, my disciples? Why are you doing this to me?" If you do it to a Christian, you're doing it to Jesus. Okay? That is pretty solid. And then when you read Philemon in the light of that, Paul doesn't, this is where a lot of people really have a problem. Paul sends his slave back to his master and tells the master, doesn't tell the master he has to set him free. I appeal to you for my child Onesimus, whom I have begotten in my imprisonment, who formerly was useless to you, now is useful to both you and me. I've sent him back to you in person, that is, sending my very heart, whom I wished to keep with me, so that on your behalf he might minister to me in my imprisonment for the gospel. But without your consent, I did not want to do anything so that your goodness would not be in effect by compulsion, but of your own free will. Perhaps he has for this reason separated from you for a while, that you might have him back forever, no longer as a slave, but more than a slave, a beloved brother, especially to me, but now much more to you, both in the flesh and in the Lord. So accept him as you would me. Paul expresses the desire. Paul wants to have Onesimus join his evangelistic team. And he's kind of hoping that Philemon will send him back, set him free, send him back with permission to do that, but he doesn't make that a command. He kind of, slyly hints at it, but he's not overturning the institution. He's not trying to start some kind of social revolution. He's not trying to start the kind of revolution we would start, where you would have people marching in the streets, or try to start a slave revolt or something like that. He basically says, here's our theology about what human beings are. There are no slaves in the church. People who have the relationship of slave to master, who are both in the church, you have to understand the way you treat a Christian is your fellow Christian brother is the way you're treating Jesus. So it's kind of like, you can have a slave as long as you treat him like Jesus. Well, we don't know how Philemon responded to that. We don't know if Onesimus was sent back to become part of Paul's mission team, or if he stayed with Philemon and served him as a slave. We don't know if Philemon treated him as a brother at the same time as having him as a slave. We don't know how he responded. For all we know, it all went right over his head. But what Paul is doing is he is planting this bomb underneath the foundation of slavery that will eventually blow up and bring the whole house down. Because by the time you get to the First Great Awakening, 18th century revival in England, you have people like John Newton, who was a slave trader, captain of a slave ship. When he became a Christian, he realized, I can't keep doing that. That was evil. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. And he meant it, because he completely turned 180 degrees because of his allegiance to Christ. He said, I can't do that anymore. In fact, I'm going to have to join up with Wilberforce. Wilberforce was a member. Newton was Wilberforce's pastor. Okay. The church that Wilberforce attended in London when he was there for Parliament was Newton's church. And Wilberforce devoted his whole life as a member of Parliament to first ending slavery in England and then ending the slave trade. Uh, these people were doing this because they were people who had absorbed the message of the Bible about what human beings are, made in the image of God, shouldn't be made into property. They need to be treated with the dignity that corresponds to who they are as creatures of God, and we can't have fellow Christians as slaves, because you would have to treat them the way you treat Christ. If you enslave a Christian, you're enslaving Jesus, because whatever you do to the least of these, that's what you've done to me, whether it's put me in slavery or give me a cup of cold water. So, Paul is not pro-slavery. Paul doesn't send Onesimus back because he's pro-slavery and he doesn't want to run an underground railroad. He's not pro-slavery. He's pro-love and pro-gospel. He's saying, look, if I try to start a slave revolt, if I try to change social structures of society in this empire where the emperor has absolute authority, it's not a democracy, I'm just going to hinder the preaching of the gospel. But I'm not going to attack slavery. What I'm going to do is I'm going to preach the gospel, and I'm going to preach love, that we love our fellow Christians the way Jesus wants us to. And in the long run, this teaching undermines slavery far more profoundly than direct opposition ever would have. Its ultimate fruit is Newton and Wilberforce. Now, it's a tragedy that it took 18 centuries for that to happen. That is an indictment not of the Bible, but of the church. Okay, Paul. If we wanted to criticize him, we would say, Paul, you're being way too subtle here. On the other hand, realistically, what other approach could he have taken? And in fact, what he did provides the foundation for the end of slavery. And it's not his fault that it took 1,800 years, 18 centuries for us to get around to realizing this and applying it. But the fact is that the Bible, even though the Old Testament permits slavery and the New Testament tolerates it and neither flatly condemns it, nevertheless, it is a simple historical truth that the Bible ended slavery in the Christian West. Now, slavery still exists. There's white slavery. There's what's called white slavery, which is prostitution, is often a form of slavery. But legal slavery is over in Christian countries and other countries who follow the example of Christian countries. And that's what the Bible did. And it's not the Bible's fault that it took 18 centuries for it to do it. Well, we are flying through this material at a rapid pace because, in fact, once you see the data, the conclusion is inescapable. Sadly true that there were Christians who used the Bible to support slavery. There's another thing. Especially in the South, there were Christians using the Bible to defend the practice of slavery, and they could do it, but they were using the status quo of the ancient world as if, like Don said earlier, they were taking descriptive passages as if they were normative, prescriptive. And the prescriptive passages that are pro-gospel and pro-love and pro-humanity, human beings created in the image of God, all of them, all from one man, all the nations of the earth, the anti-racist message. When you look at the prescriptive passages, they don't directly say you have to end slavery, but they inevitably lead to that conclusion. So it's sadly true that there were Christians who used the Bible to support slavery, but it's equally true that men with a better understanding of what the Bible teaches used their influence to end it. It's tragic that it took so long, but it was actually the Bible that ended slavery as an official institution in the West. And Christians have no need to apologize for that. Now, we need to do today the same thing that Wilberforce and Newton did in the 18th century, and that is take those normative, prescriptive biblical passages about the value of human beings and about love and apply them in similar ways to issues that are facing us today. And so Christians should be in the forefront of ending the slavery that still exists unofficially in the West, officially in Muslim countries. And it's not an accident that the pro-life movement consists almost entirely of conservative Christians, conservative evangelicals, and traditional conservative Roman Catholics. We disagree with the Church of Rome on several issues about the gospel and about the authority of the church, etc. But even though we think these guys are doctrinally off on certain key issues, they got enough of the Bible to realize that abortion is an attack on the humanity of a segment of society, which is really very parallel to slavery. You know, you arbitrarily define a certain class of people as subhuman based on whether or not
or is not human at all in some way.
Yeah, subhuman or not human would be a form of subhuman. Yeah, they're just tissue. You know, the product of conception. It's not an accident that we've been at the forefront of that, and we need to not be weary in well-doing. The Supreme Court finally came down on our side, but now that doesn't solve the problem. It just turns the battle over to the states, which means it has to continue to be fought on a local level, and a lot of states are a long way from being ready to deal with this. And so Christians need to be out there, and we need to be careful that we're coming across that what we're doing is this is an expression of love for our fellow man and woman. In fact, we have a reputation that's very different from that, which is completely unfair. That's been created by the media. In fact, the media would tell people, well, the Christians, they just care about these little unborn babies. I don't care anything about the mothers with problem pregnancies and women. No. From the very beginning, the pro-life movement has put an awful lot of energy and effort into crisis pregnancy centers, into practical ministry to those women, of compassion for them. We don't get credit for that, but it's real, and we need to continue doing it. And we need to understand that the media is going to completely distort the reality. And so what we have not done, and I think strategically we need to do, is work hard at changing the narrative, okay, at getting the real story of who we are, what we're doing, what we're about out there. And there's plenty of material by which we can do this. So one nutcase who doesn't represent the heart of the movement, the mainstream part of the movement at all, goes out and blows up an abortion clinic, and that's all over the news. And hundreds of people are adopting babies or taking unwed mothers into their homes and supporting them, or giving to crisis pregnancy clinics and centers, very practically showing love. None of that gets seen at all. And so I think we should understand that the pro-life movement is doing exactly the same thing for exactly the same reasons as the abolition movement did.
They are. And I would suggest in part it is they're having the same trouble getting the point across because it's an advertising problem. In the South, slavery was the right of the owners. And so the right of the slave was not even a consideration. You're talking about property at that point.
Mm-hmm.
We're suffering the same kind of a problem now because the argument at one point, I remember early on, I wasn't even a Christian at the time, but the battle was between pro-abortion and anti-abortion. That's how the argument was framed. And then one side got smart and said, well, this is not a good marketing. Killing someone is not a good marketing tool. And so they made it pro-choice. Now they're playing to a different audience. It is choice. You have a constitutional right. It is your choice to terminate a pregnancy.
And we tried to match that by using the phrase pro-life, which was
but that's not as powerful.
Positive spin.
Right, but it's not as powerful as pro-choice. So pro-life versus taking my rights away, my right, my freedom to choose. I really think, this is my opinion, but I think making it a human right discussion would play better. We've written on this a few times, and Scott Klusendorf did a nice.
That's very consistent with what I'm suggesting, which is that, and I'm not the first person to notice the parallel between the abolitionist movement and the pro-life movement.
Right.
But I think we need to become more aware of that, because everybody looks at the anti-slavery people as good guys. Okay. Well, if you read the Bible the way they did, and you see the principles and apply them the way they did when slavery was the issue, then you're going to be pro-life today. You know, that there's absolutely it's absolutely parallel. I don't know if I've told this story before here. I'm going to tell it again if I have. I was in Athens, Georgia, where the university is, doing some research in the library. This was some years ago. And I took a break, went downtown for lunch, to get some lunch. As I come out through the arches, which is the entrance to the campus, onto the square where the town is, there was a National Organization for Women rally taking place. And there were these two females. I was going to call them ladies, but I don't like to use language inaccurately. They were holding signs. One of the signs said, "Protect abortion rights," and the other one said, "End racism now." And I thought, You cannot serve me up a home run pitch like that and expect me not to swing at it. So I walk up to them, and I'm trying to be as polite as I can. And I said, I wonder if you could explain something for me. Uh, Clearly, you believe that it's wrong to treat somebody as less than a human being because of the color of his skin. So why is it okay to do that based on whether or not he's passed through a birth canal? The one with the protect abortion rights sign got spitting angry. I mean, she turned as red as the University of Georgia jersey. And she just spat at me. You wouldn't say that if you had a womb. And I thought to myself, do you realize you just confessed to me that you think with an organ other than your brain? But I fortunately prevented myself from saying that out loud. What I said out loud was, I beg your pardon, I do have one. This was before all the trans stuff, okay? That created a double take. And that is, I have joint custody, joint responsibility for one. Therefore, I make jolly sure nothing goes into it that I'm not prepared to take care of when it comes back out. And she just turned her back on me, refused to continue the conversation. This is what in the postmodern world is known as political discourse.
Right.
So there's a level of irrationality here. There are emotions that are driving this in terms of what people perceive as threats to their freedom, and they make it really, really hard to have a rational conversation. But people need to be confronted, and confronted as lovingly as we can do it with the truth, which is that if you think it's wrong to make slaves out of people because of their skin color, then you can't think it's okay to kill them because of their level of development. And it's about it's not about restricting your freedom. It's about protecting our fellow human beings. And
I appreciate Scott Klusendorf. I don't know if you're familiar. Yeah.
He does a good job in this area.
He does, and we've written on this before. And then I knew of him, and I got to talk to him, and we've had him on our webcast. But I really think he simplified arguments that I had already been using, some things you've alluded to, with this SLED, SLED,
right?
Size. It's a matter of size. If someone is a certain size, are they more or less human? So is Morgan less human than, say, I am, based on her size? What about someone smaller? My granddaughter is smaller than Morgan, so is she less of a human than Morgan? And you kind of work that backwards. So from the moment of conception, it's a matter of size, not much else. And the infant will grow. Level of development. Okay, so are they? How developed are they? Is there something in the development that's been hindered? So let's go to my granddaughter. She was born, but her pituitary gland had not properly matured. And so she was born with a defect. Does that make her not human because of that? So level of development, that's the next question. Environment, where do they live? If it's living, if it's a residential question, then if someone is living in my house that I didn't want to be there, do I have a right to dismember them? right? At what point do I have that right with a human? Or degree of dependency. That's a really interesting one, because if someone is dependent, if one human is dependent on another human, does that make them no longer human? They can't feed themselves. Maybe they're handicapped. Maybe they have mental incapacity issues. Maybe they're in a coma. Are you no longer human while you're in a coma?
There's
Are we
not a single one of us that could exist without help from other people.
Right.
Even those of us who are, quote, independent, if somebody doesn't grow that food and somebody doesn't put it on a truck and take it to Walmart, and somebody doesn't sell it to me, and somebody doesn't design and make a microwave that I can put it in, I'm up the creek. And there's the most independent of us is dependent on many other people for our ability to exist. So there's no non-arbitrary place where you can park that sled that on the other side of that, it's okay to kill the person.
Right.
Right.
No non-arbitrary place you can park the sled. So yeah, we're in a different world. Everything is different except it's the same. It's all the same except different. It's another way of putting it. But
They just rebranded it.
That's right.
Right.
But we've got, in fact, the church, starting with Wilberforce, the church has a really, really good track record of being the leader in the anti-slavery movement. And it's the leader in the anti-abortion movement as well. And those two facts are definitely connected.
That raises another question I'd like to ask you, because I've had so many. Rick Warren is one, for example, who seems to portray the idea that if the church had been the church, we would have none of this happening. Now, doesn't that at some point mean that it is the church's responsibility to force non-believers to act like believers in moral ways?
Well, I'm not sure what he thinks the church, if it were the church, would be doing differently.
That's exactly my point.
Doesn't that go back to
that's the question I would want to ask him if we were having this conversation. Now, and this whole idea of forcing non-Christians to act like Christians, if in fact unborn babies are human beings, then you don't have to be a Christian. Okay, if you're not a Christian, that doesn't mean it's okay for you to commit murder.
Right.
If you're not a Christian, that doesn't mean it's okay for you to steal or to rape. I mean, there's a lot of moral issues where, trying to change the law so that it reflects reality is not trying to make people act like Christians. It's trying to make them act like civilized human beings.
Right.
Okay. Now, Christians have a better, more consistent and well-grounded rationale for why murder should be wrong than non-Christians do. But that's not a Christian versus non-Christian issue. It's an issue of fact.
Right.
It's an issue of which is more important, biological facts or your personal desire. And if I find one of you inconvenient and bump you off, the cops are going to put me in jail. And whether I'm a Christian or not has nothing to do with it.
Right.
And whether they're Christians or not has nothing to do with it. So I think we jumped way too quickly to this this theme of not making non-Christians act like Christians. We haven't actually thought about that to the extent that we should. So I'm not in favor of a law requiring everybody to go to church. You know, let's pick things actually that only Christians do, or only Christians have a reason to do. I don't want to coerce people to do that. That doesn't promote faith. It only promotes hypocrisy.
Right.
Okay.
True.
But this is not that kind of issue.
It is not that kind of an issue. I do, and I agree with you. We need to try to persuade legislation to favor our view, but we do that as citizens who are Christians.
Right.
However, we can't force government to legislate according to our views. So that's where the whole process of living in a democratic republic comes into play. Everyone has a right to try to persuade their legislators to pass laws that support
there's no reason for Christians to be the only people in society who are forbidden to have their voting influenced by their beliefs.
Right.
Isn't that
here's the thing. This goes back to the 95 Theses for a New Reformation. Why have we failed
Hang on, Jeff.
to influence law and society politically? Because we have failed at our more basic mission of evangelism and discipleship.
Correct.
If we were even discipling the people we evangelize, because we're not evangelizing very effectively, but people do still become Christians. If we were discipling the people we evangelize, we'd have a different impact than the one we're having. I don't think it's realistic to say that if we were doing that, that would automatically solve all of our problems. But if the church was being the church, if it was serious about evangelism and discipleship, then we would have a whole lot more success than we have had in influencing the culture.
There would be an impact, yes.
All right, Jeff's been trying to say something.
Jeffrey.
Yeah, I'm starting to find out why sometimes I can't break in here, because really,
You just muted yourself.
You turned your mic off. We can't hear you.
perfect.
There you go.
So basically, Don was just saying we're in the same place we were. And when you asked the question, it's answered by this lecture. Like Don said, what did Paul do? So if you think back to everything Don Williams was talking, well, a lot of it, and how Paul reacted, we're the same place we were. And at the end, by me not interjecting, he said that all a little differently and more effectively. But really, it's the same thing Paul did. Focus on the gospel. That's how you get. What could we really do? Are Christians supposed to force? We don't have that power. Go ahead and try. So anyway, there you go.
Right.
Thank you, Jeff.
Well, that's one thing, and I've said this often. Just Don said it now, because I've had several people contact me, especially with where things are at politics today. Is how do we go back to where we were? I go, you never can go back that way.
Right.
Well, then what do we do? How do we change things? I said, one person at a time. Here's how Paul did it, and he did it in his letters, and he did it in his lifestyle. The other apostles did the same thing. Is they led people to the Lord and they discipled them. The Spirit transforms individuals who in turn reach out with the gospel, and others come to the faith and they are transformed. And guess what happens when you have sufficient number of people in your area transformed by the gospel? Culture begins to change.
Exactly.
because you're treating one another differently if you're living out the biblical ideas that are supposed to be taught in the churches that we attend.
Yeah. Change in the culture, right? Change becomes, and the culture becomes a byproduct of all that is happening.
Right.
To individuals,
Right.
basically.
Right.
But it's kind of like we think that the church has so much more power than it does. Right? We say, shouldn't the church be forcing, to do this? Well, look back to Paul. We're already working on trying to get that done, but that power isn't given to us to make the non-believers conform to God's will in all things, or it would be happening, because it's not like we're not making efforts in that direction,
Well, that's true, but we can have a more Christian-like environment in the sense
Right.
of, if we're in the U.S. at least, you can't do this in all countries, but in the U.S. currently, at least still today, we have the right to vote.
Mhm.
And if we vote for candidates that support our views, they likely will do legislation, as Don has alluded to prevent some of these things. Unfortunately, we see this happening in states right now, even though they have laws, say, against, I don't know, rape, that doesn't mean that the attorney general there will prosecute those.
Right.
He may just let them go because they're just busy doing other stuff.
Right.
Now, but we have lost kind of the Judeo-Christian ethos 10 or 15 years ago.
Yeah.
So in a sense, we're kind of starting back where Paul was at in a pagan culture, which means, like Don said, reach out with the gospel and evangelize. Disciple your people.
Right.
As you
And-
disciple your
and,
people, they were transformed. Pardon, Don?
Remember that carts are carts and horses are horses, and they're supposed to come in a certain order.
That's true.
Horse before cart.
The cart.
And the horse is
Oh, boy.
the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
Where Paul was pro-gospel, pro-love, and that was his indirect way of being anti-slavery.
Yes.
So,
Good
Yeah.
point. Mm-hmm.
horses in front of carts in front of horses doesn't work.
It doesn't. Oh, no. All right. And so, everyone, the few that are out there tonight, thank you for joining us. Those who will watch it afterwards, send in your comments and let us know how you're doing. We are meeting next week, right?
What
We're
is
meeting
it?
next week?
And 12th? Oh, the 19th.
Today's the 12th. Next week is the 19th.
Next week.
Yeah, we should still be
Is
good.
it not?
Mhm.
Okay. See you all next week.
All right.